All right, welcome everybody. This is likely your last session at TC. I can't believe it's almost over. So thanks so much for taking the time to learn, hopefully a little bit more about Ask Data. That's why we're here. And if you weren't here for an introduction to Ask Data, I think you should stay anyways, because it's gonna be awesome. So my name is Ruhab. I'm a product manager on the Ask Data team.
And I'm Jared Briskman. I'm the other product manager on the Ask Data team.
And we're gonna have a lot of fun today. Smaller crew, so it's gonna be intimate. We'll have time for Q&A at the end. But you know, we're all data people, so what better way to tell you a little bit about myself than with data? So I've been in the Valley for almost 5 years. I've been part of the 4 awesome releases of Ask Data that we've shipped. I have 3 pets. I love animals. This is my second TC. Been in Tableau for about a year and a half. And I had to do a countdown, so I don't know what to put for one besides my one fiance who's up there on the screen. So that's a little bit about me, and here's Jared.
For a little bit about me, I'm a more recent addition to the Ask Data team, and just finished an undergrad degree in modeling and analysis, which turns out to be a pretty perfect fit for Tableau. And I've been to about, 0.9 of a conference so far, so right up to one by the end of today.
Who are my other first-timers at TC? All right. Oh, man, that's amazing. Hope you all had fun. OK.
And now that you know a little bit more about us, we'd like to get to know you a little better. So who here has more on the analyst side? You're building dashboards, you're working with data every day. Raise your hands. Yeah. Nice. Awesome. Anyone here more on the IT governance and leadership side? You're working to make sure that your solutions scale. Yeah.
We love you.
Nice. Thank you. Anyone here had the chance to use Ask Data before? No wrong answers? OK, great. Well, there's going to be something in this session for each and every one of you. And as for what's actually in this session, we're going to have just an overview of why we built Ask Data and some context around natural language processing and augmented analytics as a whole. Then we'll dive right into what Ask Data can do, and we'll show you where you can use it across the Tableau platform and beyond. We're going to talk about some best practices for using Ask Data to make sure that it works best for you. And we'll give you a little peek behind the curtain at some of the powerful technologies that actually enable this natural language analytics experience to happen. Finally, we'll save some time at the end to make sure you know where you can go to learn more, and we'll have some time for Q&A.
OK, so let's take a second to talk about why we built this thing in the first place. Our mission at Tableau is to help people see and understand data. It's what we do, and we seriously live for that mission. And one of the reasons we built Ask Data is that we can enable even more people to be self-sufficient with analytics. How do you enable ways to answer those basic questions for everyone? Can anyone guess the most important word in that mission statement? All right, I kind of gave you a hint by bolding it, but I've got a funny story about this. I was actually asked that exact same question my second week at Tableau by our CEO. It was during onboarding. Adam came and spoke to us and asked that question. He goes, hey, what's the most important word in that mission? And again, it was my second week. I was sitting in the front row, I was eager, so I just raised my hand. I'm like, it's data. And he's a nice guy, but he was like, no, it's people. I don't think you'll be quizzed on that at any point, but just thought I'd share that because people are at the center of everything that we do. And again, Ask Data is actually about enabling more people to be comfortable with self-service analytics. So you've probably heard the term augmented analytics a few times in conference, in the keynote, and we'll be talking about it a little bit today. So I just want to make sure that we define it so that we're all on the same page on what we mean by augmented analytics. And augmented analytics is all about leveraging capabilities like machine learning, AI, NLP to help people make better decisions by allowing new kinds of interactions with technology, surfacing insights that were previously hidden, and using those approaches and keeping people at the center of their data. OK, so now that we've defined augmented analytics, let's take a second to talk about what NLP is. NLP is an abbreviation for natural language processing. And it's really a broader domain that has a lot of subdomains. So let's talk about all the various sort of threads that exist within NLP. The first is natural language understanding. It's all about understanding the intent behind how someone is trying to interact with a system or a computer or a machine. This really became prominent and popular with voice assistants like Siri and Alexa, but they don't always understand, right? So the understanding part is an interesting challenge because language is unconsciously evolving, and that's a really interesting challenge for people who work in this domain. Natural language generation is another domain, and that's all around captioning data. How do we reason about the data from a systems perspective and communicate back to people through captions? And that's what natural language generation entails. Then there's natural language querying, which is a relatively new domain. It's around taking the intent of the human and actually creating analytically structured queries that go and analyze data and bring back responses. And you'll see there's a lot of these principles at play in Ask Data, but I want to take a second and talk about what NLP is and all the various domains that kind of make up that broader domain.
So now that you know kind of why we're building Ask Data, let's talk about what it can actually do. And at its most basic level, Ask Data is a tool to ask questions of your data in natural language and get visual answers back. And then you can ask follow-up questions and have a conversation with your data, driving new insights.
So where does Ask Data fit into the Tableau platform? As you saw in the keynote and probably throughout all your sessions, there's a lot of depth to the Tableau platform. Everything from data access to prep, content discovery, analytics, and collaboration. Everything in the platform is built to work together. And Ask Data fits in this analytics layer, but you'll see through some of the demos that we can harness the power of the broader platform and leverage all the capabilities that are built into the depth of the Tableau platform. So even though we're talking about Ask Data in the analytics layer, you'll see a lot of the peripheral functionality that's built across the platform be part of the experience.
And speaking of analytics, there are 6 basic analytical capabilities that Ask Data supports. This is aggregations, grouping, filtering, limits, sorting, and calculations. And these are just broad domains. And I can already see some of you kind of trying to drag and drop these questions in your head, and that's great. But with Ask Data, you don't have to think about how you're expressing these questions. You can just ask them in the language that you're thinking about them. And let's just see this in action instead of reading from slides. So here I am in Ask Data. And you can see on the left, I've got my familiar fields panel, where I can see what fields and columns of my data actually exist. I can see this is a wines data source. And as I start to go through, I can see there's information about the locations of these wines. I've got taster information, information on the specific wine title, variety, and vintage. And finally, I've got some measures, a measure of points and a measure of price. And as I hover over each of these fields, I can see a baseball card with some summary statistics, so I can start to understand my data before I even ask my first question. Here, I can see the points are mainly distributed between like 80 and 100 points. So these are all pretty good wines in this data set. And if I want to ask a question, I just ask it in natural language. So let's find out what the average price of this whole data set is by asking average price. And I can see, just like that, that the average price of all these wines is $35.47. But this is also Tableau, so I still have access to all the same visual point-and-click analytics that I'd expect. If I want to change my question, I can click on what I asked and refine it through a normal GUI, like if I wanted to ask about the points field instead of the price field, and if I wanted to aggregate by the median instead of the average. I can refine my question, and my visualization will change to reflect my new intent. But I can also ask follow-up questions, like what if I wanted to break down these median points by country? Here, Ask Data knows that I'm talking about the country field, and will show me a visualization that's most appropriate to actually represent that question I'm asking. In this case, it's a map with the median points across every country here. If I want to ask a new question or follow a different avenue of analysis, I also have access to sheets, just like a normal Tableau workbook, at the bottom here. So I can open a new sheet and start to ask another question. Like, now I know the average price of this whole data set is $35. So what if I want to know the number of wines with a price under $35? And Ask Data knows that I'm talking about the count of title with price at most $35. That's 15,000 wines in this data set. Great, I'm a little cheap with my wine. And if I wanted to break this down again, I can ask a follow-up question. The Ask Data team's mostly based in Palo Alto, California. So we're in Northern California, and we love our Napa Valley wines. They're local to us. So if I wanted to ask just about wines in Napa Valley, I'll just type in Napa Valley. And Ask Data knows that I'm asking about the county field here. Notice I didn't have to specify county in Napa Valley or some kind of rigid query. I can just directly access the values in my data set and ask a question the way I'm thinking about it. I can see there's 316 wines from Napa Valley under $35. Let's break this down by variety. And we can see that the most popular variety of these wines in Napa Valley under $35 is Cabernet Sauvignon. Great, I love Cab Sav. But what if I wanted to sort these not by how many wines there are, but by some other field, say their average points? I'll just ask my data, sort by average points, maybe in descending order. And I can see here that there's some higher rated, more exotic varietals, but really, those Cab Savs are cheap and a great bet for any Cab Sav from Napa Valley. Awesome, instant insight. Let me ask a different question. Maybe I want to know about the tasters that are actually rating all these wines. Let me just look at the top 5 tasters by sum of price. Let me spell of correctly. And I'm looking at the top 5 tasters by sum of price. And classic issue, I've got nulls in my data set. But that's fine. I can just tell Ask Data to exclude nulls. And it knows that I'm asking to filter taster name to exclude those nulls. And here I can see that Roger Voss has had almost $150,000 worth of wine in this data set. That's like 4,000 very expensive wines. If I want to add his Twitter handle, which I also see in this data set on the left, I'll just say, and by Twitter handle. To add the taster's Twitter handles to this viz, and I can see he's at Voss Roger on Twitter. So I want to direct message him and see where he's going, because I want to go too. Finally, Ask Data is powerful enough to have a deeper analytical conversation if that's the insight you want to have. So if I wanted to ask these year-over-year type growth questions, which normally would require table calcs and more complex analysis in desktop, I can just ask them directly in natural language, like, what's been the year-over-year growth in price over time? And you can see the Ask Data knows that I'm asking about the year-over-year difference in price over vintage. You'll also notice I didn't specify vintage as a field. I was just asking about time. But Ask Data can infer that vintage is the most relevant time field in this data set. And I have a year-over-year difference graph without having to mess with table calcs or any more complex analysis. And I can still ask follow-up questions like, got a lot of wine here. Let's just look at after 1970. And I can also refine this by maybe instead of seeing the absolute difference, I want to see it as a percentage. And I can see there's a single kind of value here that's a big spike. It looks like it's 400% more than the previous year. But I can also see that it's just one value that's throwing that off. And so if I wanted to find that outlier that's throwing off my analysis, I'll just ask about wines from 1990. And I'll find that it's Mort and Chandon's 1990 Dom Perignon Rosé. That's the single wine that was an outlier in my analysis, and I was able to find that easily and quickly with Ask Data. That was hopefully just a little taster course of some of the things in Ask Data and the powerful analytical capabilities.
Thanks, Jared. Okay, so now that you know a little bit about what Ask Data can do, what are the use cases for Ask Data and the workflows that you can enable today? So let's talk about how to potentially identify some of those use cases. The first thing to do is talk to and assess your current stakeholders that you interact with on a day-to-day basis today. Think about who's leveraging dashboards today. What data do they care about? Who's asking you those follow-up questions, sending you emails for ad hoc analysis? Those are likely really great candidates for these data conversationalists, people who are probably struggling with self-service today and need a better mechanism of answering those basic questions that you saw Jared answer with Ask Data today. And with a little domain expertise, we can even think about who should be using data, but probably aren't. So now that we know potentially who these conversationalists are, what data can I use to jumpstart my Ask Data usage? One great way to identify data is just look at your current Tableau usage today. Think about all the data sources that are in your site or server that are being used, and the dashboards or reports. That's a great way to identify the data that you already have. And Ask Data works on all the published data sources that you have in your organization today, and that's a great way to quickly get started. We'll talk about the importance of data curation in just a little bit, but you have a great starting point with all the published data sources that already exist and that are being used by your organization. And when we talk to some of our customers around, who are the users and conversationalists of Ask Data, the most frequent examples that we hear are just, the business, knowledge workers, people who need data but aren't analysts by profession. And these might be individuals in sales, marketing, finance, or operations, but not limited just to those. Those are just some of the use cases that we hear from our customers and all the conversations that we have. So that's a great way, just ask a few quick questions to identify who might be a good candidate, what data you can leverage today, and that's a great starting point to begin your Ask Data journey. So now that we know who potential candidates are, how can I actually build workflows around Ask Data for my organization? And we'll talk about 3 ways of applying Ask Data with Tableau. The first is accessing published data sources directly. The default experience for going to a data source is Ask Data. And you can do that by searching for it through the global toolbar, by favoriting data sources, or leveraging a new toolbar button that we've built in that allows you to go from a workbook directly into Ask Data. And don't worry, we'll walk through an example in just a few minutes about all the use cases that I'm mentioning here. The second way is to leverage the embedded capabilities of Ask Data. And you can embed Ask Data directly into the dashboard starting in 2019.3. And I'll walk you through an example of how to do that. Do that by bringing in a web zone directly into the dashboard, or leveraging other dashboard capabilities like floating containers to make more interactive experiences of Ask Data directly in the dashboard. And lastly, you can use those same embedded capabilities by bringing Ask Data outside of the Tableau platform. Think about your internal analytics portal or your websites. You have a lot of flexibility in how to build workflows for Ask Data. And the key thing to ask is, what are the workflows that my conversations have today? Find something that works for your users and bring Ask Data to where they are today. And you have a lot of different options on how to do that. So I'm actually going to walk you through a few examples of those workflows and show you how you can, again, get that same conversational analytical experience directly through these entry points. All right, so let's talk about the data source. So as I mentioned, can I close this one?
Sure.
Okay. So as I mentioned, the default experience of going to a data source is Ask Data. So if I'm searching for, let's say, wines or some data directly through search, if I go to that data source, it's going to default to Ask Data. So that's how you would access it if you're trying to go to the data directly. But we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about the embedded cases. So here's a dashboard on wines. Yes, it's a legit dashboard that I've used at the grocery store before as I'm searching for my Pinot Noir. And you might notice that there is this icon in the top right corner. And if I can get my zoom working exactly how I want it. OK, we don't have accessibility on this. OK, so this button is just a floating container that I've brought into the dashboard. And with a little quick way of embedding Ask Data, you can actually open and sort of close that container and then get into that Ask Data workflow directly into the dashboard. So you saw Jared go find those cheap cabs, Sauvignons, but what if you have some snobby wine friends, right? And you want to find more expensive wine. Let's look at what is the most expensive, if I can spell, wine in the US. And now I'm asking those follow-up questions directly here in the dashboard with Ask Data embedded in that container. And if I want to go into a more in-depth workflow, you'll see that I have an Ask Data button here in the toolbar that automatically detects the data source associated with that workbook or dashboard and allows me to go in directly into that full modality of Ask Data that you saw Jared walk through earlier. And now I have the full spectrum of capabilities of Ask Data directly from the dashboard. So let's walk through a few more examples so that we can see Ask Data in action again. All right, so the question that I want to answer is finding a really expensive wine so I can impress my friends. So I want to look at all the states of wine-producing regions and see which states have that expensive wine that I might be interested in. So let's look for what's the max price by state. And of course, I have a global data set, so it shows me provinces and states across all the wine-producing regions. But if I only care about, let's say, the United States, I can just ask a follow-up question to filter this data down by saying, in the USA. And notice when I typed the USA, the interpretation that comes back from Ask Data actually shows a country code of US. Ask Data is smart enough to automatically infer these relationships of geographic concepts because we often have a lot of different ways of talking about these things, right? I may say USA or the United States, but if my data is abbreviated with country codes, you don't have to worry about that because we automatically understand those relationships to allow you to express those questions in a conversational way without having to go and really tweak the underlying data model for things like geographies. And we'll touch a little bit more about sort of the semantics and how that works a little bit later. Okay, so now I've filtered my data down, and automatically with this color gradient, I can see that California has the most expensive wine, which I would have probably assumed, given that Napa Valley is in California. But price isn't the only way to look for good wine. Points is another comparison. So let's layer in points to see if we can get a relative comparison of how points and price are correlated. But first, I'm going to change the visualization to go from a map view to bar chart. And I can do that in Ask Data in a variety of different ways. I can simply toggle through this drop down here, and I'll see all the other viable options for visualizations for that specific question. We're not going to show you scatter plots here because that just doesn't make sense. Or I can leverage natural language to make those visualization changes. So I can simply ask a follow-up question to see that as a bar chart and make that update. And again, I was trying to get to a comparison of points and price. So let's look at the average points as well. And I'm simply typing the average points, and now I'm seeing a side-by-side comparison. And what I can see immediately is that points are fairly uniform across states. Most of the states are producing good wine, but price definitely skews towards California. You're definitely getting that Napa Valley premium. And the interesting insight here is my top 3 states by points. I have Oregon, Washington, California, and Oregon is actually the cheapest relative to those 3. So I may want to drill down into wineries in Oregon and find a good selection there. So I'm going to ask a follow-up question and explore some of the wineries in Oregon. Okay, let's take a second and talk about what just happened here. I typed wineries in Oregon, and I see a variety of different options for Oregon. And that's because the value of Oregon exists across multiple fields in my data. It's a county, it's a state, and it's actually a variety designation as well. If you're asking about values and you didn't specify the exact field, we'll give you all those fields back so that you can make a selection that makes sense for you, because that value exists in a variety of different places. And in this case, I actually meant province or state, so I'm going to make that selection. And Ask Data actually infers the sum of number of records to give me a more analytically useful visualization by giving me a distribution of all of the different wineries in Oregon and by how many varieties they have, because that's the record level detail that I have in my data source. And I can see immediately that Adelsheim, this winery, has the most number of varieties. So if I want to explore those varieties, I can ask a new question and explore the varieties in Adelsheim. And again, you can see that we understand that Adelsheim is a winery without having to specify that it's a winery. So now we can see Adelsheim loves their Pinot Noirs and Chardonnay. They're most two popular or most commonly produced varieties. But let's break this down to look at how expensive those varieties are. So I'm simply going to ask for the average price instead, and we'll see that Ask Data knows that we're looking to replace the sum of number of records and look at the average price instead. So I can see that not only is Pinot Noir the most common variety, but it's also the most expensive. Great for impressing those snobby friends. And let's take a look at the exact titles of wines of these varietals. So I simply typed in title, and now I can see all of the specific wines produced at Adelsheim broken down by price. And now I can make my selection and throw that awesome Thanksgiving party.
And if Ruhab wanted to share this workbook, say with me, he could actually save this whole Ask Data session, all of these sheets and tabs, by just clicking this Save button and saving this workbook right to server. Let's call this Expensive Wines. And he'll be brought right into a Tableau workbook where you could leverage all the rest of the powerful capabilities in the Tableau platform, like setting an email subscription, or maybe setting a data-driven alert, or even going right into web edit.
Actually, can you go to the web edit real quick?
Sure.
The one interesting thing to highlight here is that if you're new to Tableau, this is a great way to see how this would have been reconstructed in drag and drop. And if you have more sophisticated analysis that you want to do, you have the full power of web editing, but starting in a simple modality like Ask Data. And ultimately, if you want to operationalize those insights and come back to those great wine metrics, you can construct a full dashboard from this. And all that underlying data is accessible for you and standard report that you can do. Mm-hmm. So all you would have to do is, again, create a dashboard by clicking on the Open Dashboard button. You can just walk through that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so just drag those sheets in, and again, you can create a full dashboard generated from Ask Data.
If you wanted to share this faster as well and not save this to server, there's also link sharing, where I can just click this link sharing button. Excuse me, that's the embed button. Let's click this link sharing button, and I'll just get a link that I can share over email or Slack, and anyone that follows this link with the right permissions will be able to jump into a copy of the sheet that I was working in to see my analysis and then ask follow-up questions as well. It's really powerful.
The great thing about link sharing is that if you have ad hoc analysis that you don't want to create published content for, it's a great way of sharing those insights without actually saving and publishing workbooks to the site or server. So it reduces clutter, but it still facilitates that collaboration that we all very much appreciate in analytics.
And now I'd like to take a little time to share some best practices about using Ask Data. And really, it comes down to three things. But first, does this data feel familiar to anyone? Not the specific data, but kind of some cluttered fields. Maybe it's been pulled together from a few data sources to answer that one question, or a little quick and dirty to build that dashboard. No need to raise hands. We've all been here. And this is great data to build a dashboard from. But with a little bit of lightweight curation, it can also be a great data source for natural language analytics. And so it really comes down to first making sure that you have the right data in your data source to answer the questions people might have. This means that your data should be at the right level of detail, and that you should have the right fields to answer common follow-up questions that a user might have, and make the data actually relevant to break down. And this doesn't have to be every possible follow-up question someone might have, but try and cover the common use cases. Could be informed by going to the new Tableau catalog and looking at what visualizations are actually built off your data source and what questions people are trying to answer. But just common sense and intuition go a really long way. Second thing is taking out what you don't need. If there are lots of fields that aren't relevant to your dashboard or your natural language analysis, just take them out. Not only is this a best practice for Tableau performance, it's actually a best practice for the performance of your users. You want to give them a manageable amount of data so that they can build a mental model of this data as they're asking questions. You really don't want to overwhelm them. Ask Data can handle 1,000 fields in your data source, but the person asking your questions can't. Finally, make sure the data you do have is set up for success. This means having typable, meaningful names. Like order date is a much, much better name than date3_final_. Like, we've been there. And also make sure that you've set your data types and data aggregations by default to the correct thing. Make sure that Tableau knows that if you have a discount field, that it's a percentage, and it probably should be averaged before it's summed. Users can still ask whatever questions they want, but having smart defaults will make it a lot easier for their analytical experience. Lastly, you want to make sure you have lots of field and value synonyms to actually reflect the way that you talk about your fields and your concepts. We all have lots of different business jargon and acronyms for the same things. And so one field name probably can't represent all the ways that someone might ask about that in natural language. And that's OK, because Ask Data is a natural language tool. And we support all the different varieties of ways someone could reference the same actual field concept. And let me show you how to add those in Ask Data. You might have noticed before that we've been asking questions about wines. But if I look in this data source, there's no wines field. There's actually a title field. But if I look in this card, there's synonyms for wine and label. And that means that I can reference those even though it's not the actual name of the field. And with the right permissions, if I'm a site or server admin or the data source owner, I can also add these field level synonyms or value level synonyms. If I want to add a field level synonym to winery here, I'll just click on this edit button in the fields panel and add a synonym for producer, say. I could add more synonyms if I'd like, but I also could add value synonyms. Let's say for that cab sav that I love, if I go into variety here and I go into the unique values, I can actually add a synonym for cab sav. So that when I'm asking a question, the way I'd actually ask it, like show me cab sav, caps lock on, shouting at Ask Data. Show me cab sav by producer. Ask Data knows that I'm talking about wineries and filtering that variety to Cabernet Sauvignon. So those synonyms are instantly usable from the moment you add them for all users of that data source. So you don't have to have everyone keep repeating those synonyms. Oh, while we're here, you might ask, how do I know what synonyms to be adding to this data source? At the bottom right, you'll see that there's this usage analytics button. And again, with the right permissions, I can see all of the usage of this data source and who's been using it and what questions they've been asking in a pre-built dashboard. You can see here it's just been me practicing for this presentation. But if there are more users, all their questions would show up here, along with what fields they've been asking questions about and finding valuable. And actually, if we scroll down, we can see what questions they've been asking, and both in the natural language and how they've been interpreted, and what visualizations have resulted. So this helps us find out if people are asking questions that aren't answered by this data source, or if they've been finding certain questions really useful and asking them again and again, maybe that's a starting point to reach out and build a dashboard to help that use case. I'd also like to point out right next to this usage analytics button, there's a feedback button. And if anything in Ask Data doesn't work the way you expect it to, or something works great and you want to love it and you want to tell us, or there's a feature idea that you have, you can share that direct feedback right back to the product team right here. And when I say share that feedback with us, I really mean us. This pretty much directly slacks Ruhab and I. So it's a great direct connection to be able to get feedback on something that's not working right. And now I'd like to take a little time to show you some of the powerful technologies that are actually enabling this natural language experience. And it really comes down to 3 different things. There's our semantic data model, there's our natural language parser, and there's natural language querying, which Ruhab touched on before. And we'll break these down one by one. Let's start with the semantic data model. What is semantics? It's the study of meaning. And more formally defined in this context, that means computationally modeling any of the metadata that allows us to reason about what your data means in the real world. That's still a lot of words, so let's see what that means in context. I've got some data here. It maybe came from a spreadsheet, a database, doesn't really matter. It's data. It's got rows and columns, fields and values. In this case, it's weather data. Let's take a look at some of these fields. Maybe high temp in the middle. When you import this into Tableau, you get so much more than just those rows and columns. Tableau knows about the name of this field, high_temp, but it also knows about an alias for this field that we've defined, high temperature, and any synonyms that we've defined, like peak or maximum, to reflect the way that we actually talk about this data. And it also knows a host of other metadata that we use to infer lots of smart things across the product. And this is true for values as well as fields. Let's look at Massachusetts here. Massachusetts is a real concept in the world. It's a place, and Ask Data can automatically infer that it's got a map representation, this polygon. It knows synonyms for it. It knows that it's part of the United States. But we also have the user-defined synonyms, like the Bay State. And so there's this blend of automatically enriched and user-defined data at the field and value level. And all of this semantic metadata, along with usage statistics and descriptive statistics of your data across the Tableau platform, feed into the semantic data model, allowing it to resolve ambiguity in questions and make smart recommendations to the natural language parser.
So let's talk about some of that ambiguity that you would expect to see in a natural language system. All of that information in the semantic data model helps us be more accurate in terms of how we actually parse that question and derive an analytically accurate intent. So our natural language parser allows us to look at the structure of the sentence, understand what's important, and ultimately pass that into our natural language querying to create a query. So let's break this down, token by token or word by word. Here we have a query, recent income from chairs in Germany. And you can see in the bottom, we've resolved that to sum of sales, filtered product subcategory to chairs, with country in DE and order date in the last 3 weeks. So how the heck did we go from that question to that query? We're gonna break that down. Recent is a linguistic concept of something that we call a vague predicate. It doesn't have an absolute definition, but we can leverage a lot of the great information that we get from usage of Ask Data to resolve this vague date-time concept to the most salient date-time entity in that data source, which happens to be order date. And based on the distribution of that field, we can infer a reasonable default, like the last 3 weeks. But if that doesn't match your definition of recent, you can easily change that to be the last 2 months or 2 weeks through the refinement experience that you saw Jared do earlier by simply clicking on that and changing the definition. But we'll always give you a good starting point if your question was ambiguous or underspecified. With income, you can see that we have a synonym for sales mapping to income. But there's also an aggregation that's missing from sales. What do we mean by income? Do we mean the total income, the average income, the median? Again, we can leverage those default aggregations and usage information in terms of how people are using those fields to fill in the missing pieces so that we can make this an analytically complete query. Our data index allows you to express these value concepts like chairs without having to understand that chairs is a value belonging to the product subcategory fields. Maybe I don't know the data. I don't understand the hierarchy or the complexity of it, but I understand the values or the products that I sell or the regions and where my sales team operates. I can just talk about those values, and Ask Data will traverse your data to understand the relationships of those values to all the fields in your data source. And lastly, here's just another example of our semantic knowledge. You can see here that I typed in the term Germany, but again, if my country data is modeled as state codes, we can infer those relationships again that we know that Germany is the same thing as the country code DE. Okay, so how does our natural language querying work? As you saw in all the questions that we went through earlier, it starts with text. Total sales for each region. With our semantic understanding of this, with our parsing to understand what are the valid entities in that question, we can resolve this into a complete analytical query that's ultimately going and mining that database that's connected to that data source. And from that query, you get back those same Tableau visualizations that you are familiar with today. So we go from a question, understanding the intent behind that question. That intent is resolved into an actual query that's going and mining your data and coming back with a visual response. But all of that is just seamlessly happening behind the scenes. And so you can focus on the question and the resulting visualizations without having to really worry about that data model, the indexing, the query language. The experience is first and foremost, but there's a lot of really cool things that actually help enable that.
So we're on the home stretch now. Let's just recap what we've talked about today, and then we'll let you know where you can learn more and have some time for Q&A. So Ask Data is all about empowering a new class of self-service analytics for business users that previously weren't able to ask these types of questions. It lowers the barrier to analytics for your organization. And it's for those quick follow-up questions, and it's got easy refinement to change your intent. But it also can keep pace with your deeper, more powerful analytical conversations if you want to have those. It's backed by 3 powerful technologies: our semantic model, our natural language parser, and natural language querying. And it works on all your published data sources and also a variety of embedded use cases, wherever you want to leverage it. Finally, you now know some of the best practices for setting up your data. And if you want to refer to those, you can find our white paper, Curating Data for Natural Language.
Speaking of natural language parsing, we have one of our awesome engineers who works on natural language parsing sitting right there in the crowd with all of you. So, hey, Eliana, you can give that round of applause. Without our awesome engineering team, none of this would be possible. So, thanks, Eliana.
And finally, Ask Data has been available since Tableau 2019.1. But it's also been supercharged in every major Tableau release since with lots of new features. And it's getting smarter release over release, including the just released Tableau 2019.4. It's available on Tableau Server and Tableau Online, and for all creators and Explorer license users, or interactors for those of you on our legacy pricing model. And if you want to see more about Ask Data while you're really winding down at the end of conference, you can go to Tableau Showcase in Data Village to get a little more hands-on demos or talk to some of the devs. And there might be a few slots left if you want to see some of the future things we're working on in Data Village for a session called Optimizing Content for Ask Data. But opportunities to engage with the Ask Data team don't end with TC. We're excited to partner with you, learn about your needs, and help make you successful. We've got cards at the back of the room, or this QR code up here. But if you go to tinyurl.com/askdatatc19, there's a quick intake survey just for your name and organization, and we'll reach out after TC and be in touch.